Hi, my name is Kathy Sherbrooke, and I'm the author of Leaving Coy's Hill. And I want to thank Boulder Bookstore for inviting me to talk with you all. I wish I could be with you in person like I was with my first novel, but COVID times. Leaving Coy's Hill is historical fiction, and it focuses on the life of Lucy Stone, who was a real-life abolitionist and pioneering feminist in the 1800s, and someone that I had never heard of. So I'm often asked, if I'd never heard of her, how did I end up writing a whole novel about her? And the story is that I was actually looking for names for characters for a totally different book, and I'm not sure what I Googled, but I was looking for strong women in history who've been forgotten, and up came the name Lucy Stone. And she came up in association with a really important monument in Boston called the Women's Memorial, and I am standing in front of it, and this is Lucy Stone. She is one of three women featured in this monument. The second, I'll move over so you can see, is Abigail Adams, the wife of President John Adams. And the third is Phyllis Wheatley, who was the first African American poet ever to be published in the United States. So it's a really important and exciting monument.
And I was particularly intrigued by Lucy Stone. She was the first woman from Massachusetts to earn a college degree, the first woman on record in the US to keep her maiden name, and the first woman to speak out regularly on women's rights. So, how was it that I had never heard of her before? Well, that's the heart of my story, how she got written out of history and why. So I decided to come inside for the remainder of the Q&A. I was worried the wind was making it difficult for you all to hear. Plus it got cold out there, snowing in the middle of March here in Boston, which I'm sure in Boulder you can relate to. So the next question I'm always asked is how much research I had to do to write this novel. And the quick answer is a lot, but I will elaborate a little bit. I was lucky enough to find some biographies written about Lucy Stone, which I immediately got my hands on. There are also lots of biographies about colleagues of hers, like Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass, many books about suffrage. So I probably have a stack of 15 or 20 books over here in my office that I read. But probably the single most important thing to me in my research were the troves and troves of letters that I was lucky enough to be able to read that were written between Lucy and the most important people in her life. So those were invaluable for so many reasons. I mean, obviously, to get into the emotion of her life, how she felt, how she thought, how she put her words together, how she formed sentences. Just in general, all those things that don't really show up in the facts and historical moments in a biography, but that really are the most important internal moments for an individual. So that's how I think I really got to know her better than any other way. So I essentially read everything I could get my hands on for about a year and a half before I finally just put the books down and then decided to write the story. The next question I was asked is how much of the book is fact and how much is fiction? And I love this question because when I read historical fiction, it's the first thing I always want to know. And I will say two things about that. First of all, fiction is about the emotion and about the drama. And so the reason why I really wanted to write this book as fiction is because I wanted to imagine what it would be like to be Lucy Stone. This book is told in the first person. So what was it like to travel by yourself as a woman in the 1800s when that wasn't done? What was it like to stand up in front of a crowd of angry men when women weren't allowed to speak in public, technically? And she was speaking on abolition and then, of course, on women's rights, so highly controversial issues. What was it like to struggle with, should I get married? Can I believe that this man is for real when he says he wants a marriage of equals, when married women have absolutely zero rights? And it's the thing that I've been fighting against my whole life. How do I justify that? So all the dialogue is made up. All of her thoughts and feelings are my invention. Also, she was famous for never writing down her speeches, or almost never. So her speeches I had to create. Um, so that's the first part of the answer. At a higher level, though, I stuck really close to the facts of her life. So the events of her life, whether they are public events that were historically documented or personal crises or tragedies, these are all things that actually did happen. So, in many ways, I didn't invent anything, but in so many ways, because it's about emotion and drama and finding the real core of the story, I had to invent everything, if that makes sense. The next question is, why do I think Lucy Stone's story is particularly important to tell right now? And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, Lucy Stone was fighting for women's rights, and I don't think we're anywhere near done fighting for women's rights. Women are still trying to find their voices, find a way to be respected, find ways to be authentic to themselves in a society that maybe wants them to behave differently than how they want to behave. So Lucy's really, really inspiring in that way, considering the time period in which she lived. The other part of the story that I found fascinating to research is that most of Lucy's activity happened just before the Civil War and just after the Civil War. So we're talking about a period in our country where we were incredibly racially divided, to the point of violence. So congressmen were being beaten on the floor of Congress. Sounds frighteningly familiar, doesn't it? Um, Obviously, the Civil War threatened to break the country apart. So these were issues that cut right to the heart of who we are as a country. And understanding and getting inside the skins of the people who tried to change that, I think, is incredibly relevant and powerful to helping us understand what we're going through today and hopefully helping us move forward. I will also add that while many white feminists back in that time period started as abolitionists, the women's movement has been racially fraught almost from the beginning. And I mentioned that I was really curious to understand why Lucy Stone got written out of history, and I'm not going to ruin the book for you, but let's just say that racial tensions in the women's movement at the highest levels caused a significant rift in that movement. And it's a story that we don't tell, particularly as white women. I think we need to understand that story and our place in it as part of what will help us heal racially. The next question is, what is my writing process like? So I will tell you that when I'm in the midst of a project, whether that's trying to finish a first draft or revising the fourth draft of a book, when I'm deep in a project, I really need to work every day. And by that, I mean 7 days a week. I heard the very prolific author Walter Mosley speak many years ago, and he really changed my writing life because he explained that art comes from the subconscious, and it takes days and days to get into that subconscious as we're walking around and dealing with the real world around us. And every day that we're not in a project, we come out of our subconscious, and we come out of it very quickly. It takes days and days to get into it, but it takes only a couple of days to be ripped right out of it. And as soon as I understood that, I immediately started working every single day, even if I could only grab 15 minutes. My ideal day is I come straight down from bed, grab a cup of coffee, don't even change out of my PJs, and write for as long as I can, whether that's 15 minutes that day, 2 hours, or in a good day, 5 hours before my brain starts to explode. But the most important thing is that I do it every day. So I've been asked to read a short section of the book. This is from the beginning. The only thing you need to know at this point is that Lucy is growing up on a farm and she's 12 years old, and she's been highly anticipating the marriage of her cousin Abigail to a man named Jeb. Abigail's wedding day rolled in on a wave of gray. The drizzle pecked at my cheeks and clung to old Bogue's fur, but it could not dampen my excitement. I'd never been to a wedding before. I wondered how Abigail would feel putting on the dress she'd shown me, fashioned by her mother from a bolt of pale silk the color of the sky in winter, wispy white with only a hint of blue. I had never seen such fine fabric. When I asked Abigail if she was nervous, she told me Jeb seemed nice enough and that her mother had said she would grow fond of him over time. Besides, not much would be changing. They were going to build their own cottage at Plumtree Farm so Jeb could help Abigail's father. She would still be able to ride her horse Willow on their favorite trails every day, and I could still visit whenever I pleased. I didn't understand the point of it all, but at only 12 I figured there was a lot about marriage I didn't understand. Despite my anticipation, the wedding ceremony was unremarkable, with 3 hymns, a reading from the minister, and the speaking of vows. Mama and all the older women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes as promises were made. I kept my eyes on the groom, hoping he might smile. Above all, I wanted Abigail to be marrying a kind man. Father drove us back to Plumtree Farm, the ropey veins in his forearms protruding as he whipped and steered the horses. Despite the overcast skies, the breeze was blowing from the direction of summer, and the grass soon dried. 5 or 6 families came to Plumtree to enjoy a rare afternoon of leisure. After Luther and I had our fill of rhubarb pie, I wandered down to the barn to visit Willow. He would have missed his daily ride that day, and I was sure he would appreciate some company. Abigail had taken care of him entirely for the past 10 years, from the time she was 9 years old and he was a newborn colt. She named him after her favorite tree on account of his skinny legs. No one thought he would amount to much, but she'd seen the strength in those tiny legs, like branches that can bend in on themselves without snapping. Sure enough, Willow had grown into a fine young horse. The way she rode him, they were 2 parts of the same body. They'd been inseparable for as long as I could remember. Just before I reached the entrance of the barn, I heard a sputtering sound, the unmistakable gulps of someone trying to breathe through sobs. The pitch of the weeping told me it was Abigail. I ran the remaining distance to the door, but at first I didn't see her when I peered inside. I followed the sounds to Willow's stall and found her curled up on a pile of hay in the corner, her dress crumpled around her. "What is it?" I asked, kneeling beside her. It was some time before she could speak. "He's gone," she said, and broke into a fresh set of sobs. "Jeb?" I asked, but I'd just seen him up by the house celebrating. She shook her head and whispered his name, grimacing with the pain of it. "Willow. Willow!" I suddenly realized that Willow wasn't in the stall with us, and that I hadn't seen him out grazing. Had he taken ill? Had there been some kind of accident? Abigail was trying too hard to say more. I stroked her back and waited, trying to swallow what felt like a clump of hay lodged in my throat. Finally, Abigail sat up and rubbed her face, blotchy and wet. She exhaled a great breath of air and swept her hand over her tangled hair before she spoke. "Jeb sold him," she said. "What? How can that be?" "I guess Jeb had some debts. He promised my father he would settle them right away so we could start fresh." Abigail's words were slurred with fatigue. "A man came while we were at church. I didn't even get to say goodbye." She broke down again, and I pulled her to me, trying to make sense of it. "Did you tell your father? Surely he can fix this." While Uncle Joseph teased Abigail for her attachment to Willow, "Horses are for pulling things," he'd say, I knew he had his own favorites in the barn. "Father said it's my husband's right to do what he thinks is best with his property, and it's my duty to support him," she said, clearly reciting his words. "But Willow is your property." "Not anymore." She looked small then, as if the hay might swallow her. So that's just a little snippet, and gives you a sense into the kind of thing that Lucy experienced as a young girl that taught her about the lack of rights for married women and set her on her course in life. So I will leave you with that. Again, this is Leaving Coy's Hill. I hope that you have a chance to pick it up from Boulder Bookstore, and I so appreciate you all for having me. And I love to do book groups, by the way, now that we all know Zoom. If you guys have a book group and would like me to join, just let me know. You can find my website at www.kasherbrook.com. I hope to hear from you. Take care. Bye-bye.